Avis, cette capsule a été produite simultanément en français et en anglais. Notice, this episode was produced simultaneously in English and French. Vous écoutez présentement la version anglaise. You are currently watching the English version.
Hello and welcome to Stereotypic STeist. I'm your host, Guy from the other day. The year 2023 is coming to an end, and during this holiday season, I'd like to tell you about a game that was requested a long time ago by a subscriber to my channel. Developed by FTL and published in part by Microsoft and by Software Heaven in 1987, this game is Oids. Oids is, in part, a classic space shooter released for the ST when the latter was in its infancy. If you already know the game and find it a little outdated, you're not wrong. That said, the game is one example of good gameplay, and the replayability is almost flawless.
This is a PUAP which is inspired by certain classics including Lunar Lander, which consists of maneuvering your lunar vehicle to land gently on one of the shown platforms. The score for each landing depends in some way on the narrowness of the targeted platform. Closer to Oids, we also have Lunar Battle, with controls similar to Lunar Lander, but in which game you have to shoot enemy turrets, say, as well as flying saucers, and use your tractor beam to recover the blue squares before moving on to the next planet, let's say. Finally, Oids is also inspired by the game Choplifter, in which you must maneuver your helicopter into enemy territory, avoid or shoot down tanks and planes, and rescue prisoners in order to transport them to safety.
Oids is, in a way, an improved version of Lunar Battle. It represents, in fact, a benchmark or milestone in the shooter genre with gravitational effects.
The synopsis of Oids is that the Biocrates, who rule in a parallel universe, have created a race of androids called Oids to serve them, but which they neglect until they become obsolete, after which they get rid of them, send them alive to the foundry, and make new ones. Being sensitive, affectionate, and filled with compassion towards the Oids, and disgusted by the mistreatment they suffer, you have decided to dedicate your life to saving as many of them as possible.
Yep, you've decided to dedicate your life to saving robots.
You are therefore dropped on a planet and you pilot a V-shaped shuttle, which shuttle is subject to two forces, gravity and inertia. Using the joystick, you can turn clockwise or counterclockwise, activate your thruster, activate your invincibility shield, or shoot by pressing the controller button. It's essentially the same controls as in Asteroids, except that in Asteroids, moving backwards warps you somewhere, at the risk of showing up in some asteroid's path.
Until now, it's a PUAP, a pick-up and play, but it can also sometimes be a WDIG as well as a WDID. Where do I go and what do I do?
The game manual is quite straightforward and clear, however, and barely sums 6 pages in terms of controls. What you might not guess without reading it is that you can recharge your shield with the spacebar and shoot more powerful Nova bombs by double-clicking the controller button. On the other hand, you only have 4 Nova bombs.
You can also play using the keyboard with both hands.
In terms of status display, it's quite self-explanatory. On the left is the score. Right next to it is the fuel gauge. The circle immediately after indicates how charged your shield is. The triangles just after correspond to your lives or remaining shuttles. The little men represent rescued Oids that you carry in your ship. And finally, these correspond to your remaining Nova bombs.
It's not enough to take Oids aboard your shuttle. You need to take them back to the mothership, but it won't come for you until you have 8 Oids on board, unless there are less to rescue.
As in Star Wars Episode 8, you are somewhat dependent on your fuel supply. There are 2 ways to refuel, either by returning to the mothership or by landing next to a gas station. Regarding the shield protecting you from enemy fire and collisions, its use is limited in time, and recharging it requires fuel.
So far, nothing out of the ordinary. The rest is a bit reminiscent of Choplifter.
The objective of each of your missions is to rescue Oid prisoners, say, from their respective factories. You must therefore destroy the factories while taking care not to kill Oids by doing so. Then you must land your shuttle not far from them on a flat surface, like in Lunar Lander, again being cautious not to kill them with your thruster or with your shield. Finally, after rescuing 8 Oids, you must proceed to the mothership to transfer them. If there are any Oids left to rescue, you must go back, otherwise you move on to the next planet.
2 of the challenges of the game lie in gravity and inertia.
By default, the shuttle is pulled downward at exponential speed, but it also happens that it's pulled in other directions as if being moved by space winds, or more realistically, by stations attached to the setting, whose purpose is exactly that. In addition, there's the principle of inertia, that is to say that the shuttle will maintain its movement or its shifting to the left or to the right until it hits an obstacle or until you activate your propeller in opposite direction. All this to say that if Oids consists above all of a shooter implying patience and exploration, the more you progress, the more it becomes a game of skill and reflexes due to the different forces that act on your shuttle and make it drift, not to mention antagonists that want you dead. Seriously, as of the second galaxy, first planet, we already noticed that the tone has changed. The passages are narrower, the enemies are more numerous, the turrets of attraction or repulsion make you deviate in all directions. Not to mention the teleportation spheres scattered throughout the setting, which allow you to reach inaccessible areas where Oids are sometimes hiding. The problem is that sometimes you find yourself in a narrow cave filled with enemy turrets that shoot at you as soon as you appear. The game becomes in fact so hard that I wonder how any human being can beat it. Look, here we are in the 6th galaxy, first planet. Impossible to stay alive unless you have activated your shield, and its duration is limited in time.
Another minor annoyance lies in the direction of your shots.
Whether you're immobile or moving, your shots stay aligned with the nose of your shuttle. They maintain its momentum. It may seem trivial, but accurately shooting any enemy requires planning or anticipation as to where you will be at the moment of the impact. Also, regarding the Oids that you rescue, it sometimes happens that they run away from you rather than running towards your shuttle. Even if you move a notch, they move too, like 2 magnets of identical polarity. Finally, regarding the enemies, in addition to the power plants and turrets attached to the scenery, like I mentioned just a moment ago, we have mobile enemies that chase you and shoot at you. Otherwise, among the most dreadful enemies are these power plants that explode like gigantic fragmentation grenades.
Regarding dissident Oids, the reason for them running away from you is that your shuttle is full. This being straightened out, let's now talk a bit about the realization of the game in a technical perspective.
Oids is an all-direction scrolling game. However, it's noticeable how fluid the scrolling is. That's because the displayed universe is made up of a fairly small amount of tiles that are pre-shifted. Since the majority of the screen is pretty black, you just have to take into account what isn't black for scrolling. Your ship, as well as enemy ships, enemy bases, factories, gas stations, trees, your missiles, enemy missiles, and Oids are all somewhat small sprites that have very few frames of animation.
Oids is a game that requires not that much memory as it was designed to run on a 520 ST with a single-sided floppy drive.
The principles of gravity and inertia consist of only a few values stored in memory, and in principle only require 1 byte each. One way to make things happen is to keep an eye on the Atari ST's internal clock. If the shifting value is negative or below the neutral point, we move the shuttle and or the setting a certain number of pixels to the right for the setting, to the left for the shuttle, at a certain frequency per second, and vice versa if the shifting value is positive.
We could also stick to the number of pixels we shift for each vertical blank. The result would be similar.
Same logic for gravity. To the value of the neutral state on the y-axis, we assign a specific gravity value depending on the planet or galaxy we're on. The higher the value relative to the neutral state, the more the shuttle will be pulled downwards, quickly but exponentially, which determines how often per second the setting is scrolled up. Finally, depending on where we are, there are invisible forces that propel us in directions we didn't expect. In this case, we simply modify the already established inertia and gravity values for the x and y axis respectively. The effect of attraction or repulsion depends on the distance which separates the shuttle from the power plant responsible for the phenomenon, and this is calculated using the formula a squared plus b squared equals c squared.
Otherwise, it's arithmetics and physics transposed into a game with some well-established formulas.
In Lunar Lander, we even took care to indicate the values on the screen so that the player had an idea of his speed, both in the x and y axis. In Oids, it's the same principle, it's just that we don't indicate it. In addition, the principle of gravity has long been very widespread and anchored in the world of gaming to the point that we no longer think about it. In Super Mario Bros., for example, the protagonist Mario is constantly jumping, but his jump paths are not triangle-shaped. Same observation for the Mario game that preceded it, Mario Bros. When the protagonist jumps, he can reach a maximum elevation. When he gets to it, or when he hits a platform with his fist, he begins to fall down at a speed that increases exponentially until he lands on a platform. Hence, how far we've come since Jumpman Jr. released the same year as Mario Bros. It's just that the jumping mechanics have been refined over time, and we've learned to code gravity to make it realistic or, at the very least, interesting.
This does not detract from the charm of the games published in the first half of the 1980s, in which falling from a height is as if the protagonist were equipped with an invisible parachute.
Sound-wise, regarding Oids, the tone channels are used. We certainly could have had digitized sound effects, but that would have potentially slowed down the frame rate. What's missing, in my opinion, is perhaps a musical score, like a rhythmic theme, a bit like in Alien Syndrome. Otherwise, we could have dared a sort of parallax effect other than with the starfield in the background, while keeping in mind that in the absence of a blitter chip, any element added to the screen requires additional CPU cycles to move around.
The game is okay as it is, but how does it hold up after 36 years at the time of this episode's upload?
I said earlier that the shooter-slash-rescue genre with gravitational effect might have seemed outdated in 1987, but in fact it inspired other games which expanded the concept. For instance, very accessible games like Solar Jetman for the NES, released in 1990, in which you have to collect on different planets pieces of the Golden Warship spaceship. A few years later, the game Subterranea was released for the Genesis/Mega Drive, which pushed the concept of Oids even further with very nice sound effects, soundtrack, and visuals, not to mention parallax effects. And until recently, there still were games like Oids, Solar Jetman, and Subterranea being developed, for example Gravitron 2, available for PCs via Steam. Visually successful, with a slightly retro look reminiscent of vector graphics, nice sound effects, and background music.
Where Oids sometimes proves frustrating resides in the shuttle's controls to compensate for gravity and inertia. In this sense, it's a dated concept, let's say, stemming from the era of space or even lunar exploration.
On the other hand, what saves the game somehow in terms of replayability, apart from its increasing difficulty, is the level editor, and it's a good thing to have thought of having one, even if there are limits to designing your own levels to play. Finally, Oids is an example of a game with sufficiently simple and accessible mechanics to be enjoyed by almost all generations of players, even if for the youngest, born after the year 2000, it might mean just a few shots at it before returning to Baldur's Gate 3.
This was today's episode. As usual, thanks to my patrons. If you'd like to support me, the link is in the description. Otherwise, like, subscribe, share, and don't hesitate to let me know your thoughts regarding Oids in the comments. If you're already familiar with it and own it, do you play it again from time to time? Otherwise, if there are any games you'd like me to talk about, please let me know. The list is long, but I'll cover all of these games someday. I'm Guy from The Other Day. See you soon.